as usual, one or two challenges when one does a presentation. On this particular occasion, of course, being the last person before lunch, so I'm sure you're all going to start looking hungrily at me before too long. Julian also has set me the slightly daunting challenge of making sure that I tee everything up really well, so that when he talks about ISO 8000 Part 150 later on, A, I've not told you too much, and B, I've not turned you off the subject. So that certainly is slightly daunting. I also, I suppose, when I was thinking through attending today and presenting, I was intrigued as to what my co-presenters would be saying. And I think the good news is that in that respect, I feel relatively comfortable. I think we've heard some really interesting messages so far. We've heard some things that I certainly fully agree with in terms of perhaps some of the emerging nature of what it is we really mean by data governance and the exact contents that sit within the scope of that. So Nicola talked about that, and John expressed a certain amount of scepticism as well as to whether we really have some solid, firm, complete definitions. So hopefully, what I'm therefore going to show you will lead into broadening our thoughts around what may or may not fit within a sort of strict definition of data governance, but certainly in terms of all of the practical examples we've heard so far this morning, I'm absolutely sure that the rest of you, like me, have been really fascinated by the different aspects of the data challenges that real organisations, as we all know, are facing in the current climate. So, as Julian says, my main reason for having any expertise to talk to you today is because I lead the particular working group, international working group that's developing ISO 8000. And I've been doing that for quite a while, and it's not the first time I've stood in. I'm not sure whether it's this room, or maybe it was both of them on a previous occasion where I have spoken about ISO 8000. But hopefully any of you that have heard me talking before will hear one or two new things today, which I think also reflects this emergence of data governance. And when we started developing ISO 8000 in 2008, the expression data governance wasn't really perhaps had that particular much of a profile. And so it wasn't necessarily something that we considered explicitly as part of the foundation for the standard. But as you'll see from what I've got to say, hopefully we can see some resonances. I come from a large engineering services organisation. I am an engineer by background, so this happens to be one of my favourite examples. Obviously, in the interest of balance, we've heard one or two interesting stories from the financial services sector as well. But I was quite delighted by Michael's little example because it completely and utterly plays into the story that I've got here. So the Mars Climate Orbiter, back in September 1999, was just about to go into orbit around the planet and start transmitting data back to Earth, and scientists were going to discover all sorts of wonderful new facts about Mars. The spacecraft basically crashed. $300+ million worth of a space program basically down the pan. Very, very quickly, they were able to do the investigation and identify that it all boiled down to one very specific technical point. And this was the example that Michael gave us. In this occasion, the data set prepared by one set of engineers, transmitted to another set of engineers, included a number without a unit of measure, and the number that they had written in was in the wrong units compared to what the specification said. So, of course, there are all sorts of other examples that become more complex, but from a technical point of view, this one is very interesting because it boils down right to a very specific technical aspect of how should we actually share and exchange our data. But even in this example, when you go on to read the rest of the investigation board report, you then discover that they recognise that although there could have been a very specific technical decision taken to change the way in which the data was exchanged, which could have avoided this. Not too surprisingly, there were then a range of things that sit around that, which take us into a much wider picture of what is it that we mean by data quality, what is it that we mean by data governance. And that's really what I hope to show you today. But the vision for what I believe to be the thing that we are primarily talking about in the organisations that would be represented here is all to do with what I call the assured decision capability. This isn't something I've entirely invented myself. It's a conversation, a dialogue that I've had with other people doing this sort of work in other organisations like Shell. And the decisions that we make are absolutely at the heart of this, and I think we've already heard a little bit about this morning. But clearly we're talking about data, and then again we've heard lots of references to different types of organisations and different things that are actually important to them about what they want to achieve. Here I use a particular life cycle from an ISO standard. Clearly the Dharma Book of Knowledge includes a similar type of view of the life cycle, and we've had one or two other references to life cycles. But the purpose of whatever life cycle we think of is that ultimately our data are there to support the decisions that our organisations make. And that then enables us to be taking those decisions in the most effective and efficient way possible. But again, the reason why we take decisions is ultimately because it leads through into the actions that we take as organisations with the ultimate aim of achieving the mission that we've been set. And again, ISO 8000 has been developed on the basis of taking a very generic view of data, and equally we believe the standard works for a very generic range of organisations. So it isn't just about companies driven by profit motive, but covers a range of other types of objectives that could be core to your organisation. So if that's our basic framework, we then have an understanding that there are different layers that support this. And again, we've had lots of reference to this today, talking about our IT, talking about the processes, people, and organisation. And one which, as we'll show in a minute when I start talking about a particular case study in Network Rail, very much risk being at the heart of this. And again, we've had one or two references to that so far today. And again, we can go on into other levels. We've had references to security today. So all of these things have an influence on the core capabilities. But the question is, to me, are we doing the right things across this particular infrastructure capability, and are we doing those things right? And that leads us then to the two key words that are in my mind of the governance and the assurance. So this to me is the vision of ultimately how all the pieces plug together, and actually data becomes the fuel that drives our organisations. So, ISO, International Organisation for Standardisation. For those of you that have listened carefully, of course it's actually not even properly an acronym. It's, the word ISO is, I believe, from the Greek, which is the idea of things being the same. And the saying ISO is a lot easier than the saying iOS. So that's where the name comes from. Some of you, most of you I'm sure, will be aware of ISO 9000. Absolutely at the heart of capturing the essence of what quality management is about. And again, that reflects that whole journey of how pioneers and founders of quality theory, American leaders and pioneers, then being adopted by the Japanese with all the fantastic things that they did with adopting quality into their manufacturing processes, ultimately arriving into the overall framework for how organisations adopt quality management. But there is also an international standard for information technology governance. And then another one which isn't necessarily one that would appeal or resonate with everybody in the room is to do with asset management. And this is, to some extent, engineering focused, and it is something that fits in the core business of Babcock and our customers when we serve in a consultancy role. But there are aspects of the standard which broaden the idea of asset out further. There are aspects which cover potentially things that take us more into the financial assets, that, which of course in financial services the word asset might not mean. But again, I think the reason why I'm putting these standards up here is because I want to try and paint a story as to how they all come together potentially. So, ISO 9000 embodies a very rich and substantial approach to quality. And again, one could talk through all of those bullet points and spend a long time getting your mind around it. But some of the things that really matter in there to me are things like the process approach and also this idea of improvement. So again, I think we've heard John talking very clearly about that in terms of potentially not wanting to eat the elephant all in one go, and actually understanding that often one needs to go on a journey to achieve things. The governance standard also has principles in it, and there are these 6 principles. And again, I think there are things in there which probably generally give one a reasonable sense of what's covered. I think they resonate to a large extent with things that Nicola told us at the beginning of the day. A very small observation on the conformance bullet point. I'm not entirely familiar with the history of this standard, and I would need to go and talk with the standard makers themselves as to what was in their mind. But if you think of that as being what we normally talk about as being regulatory compliance, then you would understand the point they're trying to make there. The words conformance and compliance, people within ISO get very excited about because of some supposed very technical differences between the two. But I think the comments that we've heard so far today about regulation and compliance are certainly things that we recognise from our work with our clients as being very key. And then finally, with ISO 55000, one of the absolute key things in there is the understanding that the asset is there to drive value within your business. And that follows through into a whole series of things about thinking about how, if I own a ship or an aircraft, do I polish it every day, or is that actually really rather irrelevant to the fact that ultimately what matters to me is that that aircraft is flying for as many hours a day as possible and has as many full seats as possible on it. So this then leads you into alignment, understanding what your overall strategy and your objectives are, and how you drive value through the assets that you own. ISO 8000 then has to find a space in between all of these other standards, and as has been observed by other people in the past, one of the great things about standard is that there are so many to choose from. And this diagram is only the beginning of that particular story. But what I want to point out then is that if we understand that the general framework established by ISO 9000 gives us an understanding of how it is that we achieve quality with a product in the most generic sense, then actually what we need to understand is that when data is our product, what are the things that we then begin to come across that are slightly different? One of the most obvious examples would be that in most product, in a manufacturing sense situations, you are going to be taking some sort of raw material and consuming that and transforming it, and it becomes part of your final product, or at least a byproduct in some way, if it's a means to an end, so to speak. one of the challenges that we have with data is that it's much less the case that it costs us a lot to create data. Once you've got a piece of data, it will just replicate and flow out into the wider world with very little additional cost. And of course, that's one of the things that I'm sure all of you in the room are used to trying to do, is to reverse some of the effects that come from that. But one of the key things that we actually absolutely have to understand is that what ISO 9000 tells us is that quality is not an intrinsic, inherent property of a product, of your data. Quality is about conformance to requirements. So depending on what requirements you have, you do not end up understanding what your quality is until you understand those requirements. And I think we've heard one or two references to that so far today, and I think it's certainly been implicit in almost everything that we've heard. But I feel that one key thing you take away from today is to understand is that we have to begin our journey with understanding what the requirements are, because if we don't do that, then we don't have any boundary on this perfection piece that, so John again put it so well, as good enough is good enough. I would only minor tweak I would make to that is that that good enough is what is defined by your requirements. The next point then is that we can begin to embrace the contents of ISO 55000 by understanding that if we then understand that data is our asset, then that leads us into this thought about what is the value that that data is going to deliver to my organisation, as Ben being this key thing about why we take a strategic view. And then, probably the most simple of the connections there is clearly the thing that's brought us together today, is to understand that if I have an overall sense of governance and what that might mean, how does data governance end up looking when the governance that we're interested in is connected to the data? So that's a sense of some of the broader issues around what we might be doing with standards. But what is it that ISO 8000 then gives us? You've already seen how long I can spend talking about a slide, so here I'm going to put this one up in one foul swoop and try to avoid getting dragged into the detail. But this then gives us an overall sense of what it is that we mean by data quality management. And hopefully most of the things on there you can begin to see to resonate with points I've made about the centrality of the role of data in enabling the decisions we take, and also about how we need to end up understanding what the requirements are so that we can then evaluate our quality. So the standard itself, we have already published 9 different parts, and we're developing other parts as well as we begin to flesh out the whole of this framework that I've put up there. But what I really wanted to do was just to draw us back into the particular topic of data governance and make a few points about how at the moment, as a working group, we understand the relationship between ISO 8000 and the data governance topic itself. So the first thing is that we need to establish goals and objectives for our data quality management as part of the planning process. We then need to build our policies, our procedures, and our standards off the back of understanding what those goals and objectives are. We then need to have an overall plan for what we're going to do, and we want to measure the performance against that plan. So this begins to be a feedback loop, and again, certainly that level of detail is included in the 38,500 standard that is the one for the generic governance of IT. We also, and again we've heard this from Nicola and in the other presentations as well, roles and responsibilities absolutely the core of this, and that will be a key feature of what Julian talks about when he gets into the detail of our Part 150. And then finally, supporting and underpinning that is clearly the competence and capability of our people. And again, I think that's something that's certainly come out really loud and clear in what the other speakers have spoken about so far this morning. So noting that I'm pretty much on half past now, there's a lot more obviously I could say about that, but I wanted to just end with a couple of very quick slides to show how all of that theory that I've spoken about is playing itself out in Network Rail at the moment. So this slide, again, is fascinating in many different ways. For me, not least the fact that these sorts of topics are beginning to really capture the imagination of the wider media. Clearly that this reflects the power and importance of data in our organisations, that it is becoming more and more a mainstream issue. The comment earlier that was made, possibly I think by Ian, about algorithms, on the business news this morning I was hearing that sterling went up 1.5% yesterday or something on the basis of an algorithmic bow wave or something they called it. I'm not sure what it was. Anyway, so the general public is beginning to get a sense that somehow this mysterious thing called data really is central to all of their lives. And Network Rail, no less than any other organisation, are absolutely in that state. And they, of course, like many of you with your own organisations, are subject to regulatory control. And so their dialogue with their regulator is absolutely central to how they do business. So what they are now underway doing, and they are using ISO 8000 Part 150, so again that's another good reason to listen to Julian this afternoon to hear more about the detail of how this actually works. But their project is, having adopted ISO 8000, they are looking to establish this governance framework that we've already heard about this morning, and they want fundamentally to be able to understand the quality of their data. But the thing that's most exciting in my mind about this project is that they have been able to put risk and an understanding of risk absolutely at the centre of their journey to improving their data. And the reason why this is absolutely critical in my own view is because it has enabled them to absolutely reach the top levels of the organisation. The board now absolutely understands why data quality is critical to their organisation. And in fact, it's led to the point where now data quality is one of 4 level 0 risks within Network Rail. And that for them is absolutely a really significant step, because essentially it is to do with things like loss of life and other things which are absolutely critical to the way that they see themselves as an organisation. There's a lot of technical detail about how they've actually done that, but that is not that difficult to understand once you see that detail. And certainly I can share some papers with you and so on, which gives a little bit more understanding of how they've taken that step. So their framework then has included, I think, all the things that we've really talked about so far today. Nothing on there that I think is a surprise, with the one observation that safety being such a critical strategic element of their organisation, that it then appears in their framework. For other organisations here, you perhaps wouldn't have safety at that level, but there might be other things that you could put there instead. And what that's then led to is a series of really key outcomes to making a difference to the journey that Network Rail is on with respect to its data. So again, I think Julian, I'm sure, will make some points about being recognised professionals, obviously in the context of Dharma and the certification that they do. That's a good thing to see. And Nicola also made, I think, a very key emphasis on the importance of people. And then down there, I've already spoken about this centrality of the risks, and overall, they are now on a journey towards Not solving everything in one go, as John said, that really isn't going to be feasible, but from a central resource and understanding of governance and assurance, they are now beginning to work their way through the whole organisation nationally, right down into all of the individual engineering functions, in order to begin to make sure that they have a real understanding of the data across the organisation and the role it plays in delivering safe, effective and efficient operations. So, that was all I wanted to say. Apologies for having gone a few minutes over, but what's new?
Any questions at all?
Nicola?
Can you get certified, can a company get certified in ISO 8000 in the same way that you can 9000? So many years ago, for encrypted data, we went through the pain of that. Is that possible?
So, the precise technical ISO answer to that question is it's essentially nothing to do with ISO. There are very specific rules about how the standards are written. So the standards themselves are absolutely neutral on this point. The reason why we've ended up with where we are with ISO 9000 is because people who wanted to buy goods and services recognised that by demanding that their suppliers were certified against ISO 9000, they could begin to have a confidence in the ability of those suppliers to deliver quality. And so essentially the answer is, at the moment, you can, if you look up ISO 8000 certification, you will find one or two minor things that are going on, but they're really rather narrow and rather specific. In terms of the whole framework on that picture, at the moment I know of no organisation that is doing that. My suggestion would be at this stage is that essentially, because if you like, this is sort of at the same level of data governance, and as I think we're violently agreeing here today, this is still an emerging topic. It's probably of limited value to imagine that somebody like, all the names have slipped from my mind now, but anyway, the big certification bodies would actually be looking at the moment to offer you a certificate, although I'm sure if you paid them enough money, they'd come and look at you. Because at the moment, nobody has enough sense and understanding of the value of this and so on. But ultimately, I think it will be a way that we can potentially go. There might, in the meantime, need to be some discussions because the relationship between ISO 8000 and the 38500 for IT governance probably needs to be sorted out so that we're not then asking people to have a stack of certifications against gazillions of different standards. But, yeah. Yes?
I was interested in the idea of IT governance and data governance being subsets of corporate governance, or the concept of the term. Is corporate governance something that ISO looks at, or is that something that's more rigorous than that?
So, my understanding of reading 38500 is that it makes very clear reference out to some of the underlying origins of corporate governance, and I'm going to forget now which one. There's some stuff I think that originated in the UN even for this. So I believe at the moment there isn't an ISO standard for corporate governance, but they, as I say, they try to make sure that the taxonomy that is used in the standard plays into, if you like, what are accepted as international norms for corporate governance.
When you're defining data governance, then you kind of bearing in mind that it's a subset of.
Well, I think for me, that's one of the points which is still unclear in my mind as to how firm a definition we're going to end up with. And again, maybe during the panel discussion this afternoon, it might be quite interesting to see whether that emerges as a topic. I was interested that Nicola didn't make any reference to Wikipedia, because I don't know whether to laugh or cry when I read the definition of data governance on Wikipedia. It's so absurdly narrow that I just don't know what to do with it. So I think, this to me is the point that we are still trying to learn what we really mean, And that's what, again, to me takes me back though to the Network Rail example. They have been able to make this connection from the reality of data across all the different devices that they have and so on and so on. Building that escalator, if you like, all the way to that top level corporate risk is to me a hugely inspiring story. Because that does mean then that there is a total top-down view of all of that. Yeah, thank you, Julian.
Okay.